Good afternoon, and thanks for being at our lightning session. The goal here with these lightning sessions is we do quick 15-minute topics to catch some interesting bits of information that we're being asked on a regular basis or topics that we've been asked to do. And I think in this case with the PHE, we were actually asked to do a topic on this. So we wanted to jump into it and give you a 15-minute snippet of information to be able to take back to your jobs. This webinar is being recorded, so you can listen to it on our website post webinar, or anyone that missed it can also sign in and listen to this as well. So we're going to do this in 15 minutes. It will be quick. We'll try to get as much of this PHE stuff in as we possibly can, and I know that I have some friends on this webinar as well who may also have some information that they may want to share, and so feel free to do so. We want to make this as informative as we possibly can for everyone on the call. Okay, so first thing to note is that this is where we have active PHE waivers. Now, I did this slide literally a couple days ago, whatever. We put the graphic together based on the active PHE waivers, and Hawaii, Idaho, and Virginia all expired in that time. So note to self, there's a lot of changes that are happening, as you probably know, which is why you're probably on this webinar. So most of the states do not have access active PHE waivers. Keep that in mind. So if you're in one of these states then that are green, then you know that you do have an active PHE waiver. However, you can see the vast majority do not have state PHE waivers in place. There are some exceptions. We'll want to give credit to CTEL, who did a very extensive, and you can see it on their website as well, very extensive 50-state review. And I just pulled out a few nuggets for each state. So there are some extensive, what I would call exceptions, even though those states have expired PHEs. So for example, with Arizona, we have allowing the state providers to get allowing other out-of-state providers and also some payment parity for some audiovisual synchronous visits, et cetera. Some of these states have very extensive exceptions. So if you see them, if you have a state that has very extensive exceptions, I've listed maybe one or two. Arizona is one of them that has pretty extensive exceptions. Others I've just kind of like put, you know, the ellipses at the end to tell you that there's more there as well. So in the case of Colorado, rural health clinics, FQHCs, and Indian Health Services have parity of payment. There's a ton of other exceptions that Colorado is doing as well. And again, we can look at the CTEL website for some of these as well as some other resources. In general, what we see from states is they are trying to loosen the requirements related to parity of payment in the state Medicaid regs, and in general also removing some of the restrictions, particularly related to behavioral health visits. So if you're in your state and wondering what's going on and maybe can I do telehealth at all, really look into the details here, because behavioral health visits are one of those places that most of those restrictions have been removed. And you can see in the case of Iowa, parity of payment for behavioral health visits was codified in their law. You can see in Kansas, telehealth coverage for services for Medicaid patients as well. So lots and lots of different things that are being adopted in different states, and some extensive ones in Maryland and New York. In the case of New York, we have the New York State Department of Health has done the expansion and extension of all Medicaid providers to use the wide variety of communication, as they've quote unquote put that in their regs, to be able to continue to use those services remotely during the federally declared COVID public health emergency, which one of my buddies is on this webinar and is poking me because the federal public health emergency just got extended today. I think it was signed yesterday, but essentially was released today. So we just have the extension of the federal public health emergency. In the case of New York, we'll see some of the communications extend beyond that. We're going to talk about the federal PHE here in a minute. We do have other states like Oklahoma, who's always been very progressive related to telehealth, putting parity in payment and codifying it. So this means that those things are permanent. In the state of Massachusetts, mental health parity is permanent. So when I hear from clients or from prospective clients that say, I don't think I can do telehealth anymore because the public health emergency is over, I shudder, because this is definitely not the case. We see over and over again states and the federal government trying very hard to make sure that there's some kind of payment for telehealth and telehealth services. So you just have to be creative in the way that you look at your service offerings. In the case of Tennessee, they are actually relaxing the definition of originating site. Lots and lots of states have done this. They've not only relaxed the definition of originating site, again, to allow and restricted, remove the restrictions for geographic restrictions, excuse me. And they've also, this is allowing, the originating site, geographic restriction, et cetera, to be removed, but it also has been extending the definition for telehealth and telemedicine, which has been very important because some of these services have been underneath the cloud because they're inside of the CMS regs. So for Medicaid, they're expanding that definition in their individual states such that they can start to pay for what they're calling audiovisual communications or synchronous communication, and not defining it in the same way that CMS has, so that it can come out of that umbrella. We saw that pretty creatively with RPM some time ago. In addition, we are seeing in the case of Wisconsin, preventing Medicaid from denying coverage based on location. We also see states enacting laws related to technology, saying that you cannot require a certain technology for doing telehealth. So commercial payers who have relationships with large telehealth vendors cannot necessarily require you to utilize their vendor and their providers as such, because you can't necessarily just require a particular technology. So keep that in mind as well. They're getting very savvy about the way that telehealth is being enacted. The federal PHE, I just finished this slide and then saw the announcement of the extension of the PHE. We know that the PHE will renew for 90 days and then obviously has to continue to renew. However, the Biden administration has also said that they will give a 60-day notice before the PHE expires. So none of us were like waiting with bated breath of whether or not it was going to be extended or not. We knew that it would be because they had already given us the notice that we would have, an extensive notice. In addition, in the Consolidated Appropriations Act, in the Omnibus Bill, there was also extensions for flexibilities that will continue 151 days after the first day of the end of the PHE. So what that means is 5 months past the end of the public health emergency declared by the federal government. So in some states, they have their PHEs expiring with the federal PHE. When we see those that expiring, we're not only going to get 60 days notice, but we're also going to have 5 months to figure out what to do in that case. So let's talk about a couple of ideas on what to do when this federal public health emergency and state public health emergency expires. So some considerations. Lots of folks have been putting telehealth programs together really, really quick, and they haven't really been following all the standard rules that you would if you were in an in-person visit. If you're in an in-person visit, you wouldn't even consider whether or not someone needs to have consent for treatment or not. But in telehealth, we've kind of let that go a little bit. So we are required to do consent for treatment. However, in some states, you can do it verbally via email or text message. Lots of the telehealth solutions have check marks or signature lines to be able to do that prior to the visit. So keep in mind your workflow when you think about the clinicians as well. Try not to do consent happening with your doctor because you wouldn't do that normally in the office. So what would you do normally in the office is what you'll do in a telehealth visit. Don't forget that patients can opt out in doing a telehealth visit. Define your procedures for clinicians, because up to now, they've just been doing a telehealth visit based on their own protection of COVID, for example, but patients do have the option to not do a telehealth visit and convert that to an in-person visit. So how are you going to handle that? How are you going to handle that? How are you going to make sure that the physician isn't dealing with that right at the time of the visit? Some of the things that we do and we recommend is that the clinician, again, workflow same as the visit. So clinicians are only seeing the patient post paperwork completed, office staff checking, have you completed that paperwork and is everything okay, including consent form. At the end of the 5 months that we talked about with the public health emergency, the 20% increase in Medicare payments for COVID patients through the inpatient prospective payment system, that will end, of course. So we need to think about that when we look at the COVID patients and the cost of care. So keep in mind some considerations there, and from a financial perspective, what you'll be looking at. Also, direct-to-consumer programs that where you haven't collected those co-pays. I mentioned this a little bit. Some of this will be ending in surprise billing for patients. We're seeing that a lot. And also we're seeing payers forgetting that they aren't collecting co-pays in some states, and they're actually charging those co-pays. So be very diligent with your payers related to your contracts. If you haven't currently been collecting co-pays and you're not under a public health emergency in the state, or the federal co-pays and co-pays that may be required for CMS, you got to put a process in place today to start helping people understand how to collect payments. So that's either a credit card payment or a bill afterwards, or some kind of communication to be able to collect those co-pays per contract. And again, avoid those surprise bills, because what we're seeing over and over again is surprise bills are happening, partly because the insurance companies are getting it wrong, and sometimes because our policies and procedures aren't correct and our contracts aren't correct with our payers. So I've got about 3 minutes, and I can see, excuse me, I've got about 3 minutes maybe for questions. Maybe that's 2.5 minutes. I know I'm at 12 minutes after. Amanda, do you have any questions in the chat?
We do have one hand raised. John, he did not type it in. Is there a way to let him talk?
I can. Yep, just a second. If his hand's raised. Is it John Swanson?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, John, you can talk.
Sorry, that the hand was, I intended to lower the hand. My question was really going to get to some of the audio only references that you gave with the telephone, and also just to make sure that the deck was available, because I think it's very good.
Yes. Yes, thank you for that. Yeah, so the deck and the recorded webinar will definitely be available. And what was your question around the audio only?
Well, there's been a lot of back and forth on audio only, and really paying attention to the changes that are being allowed for use of audio only, especially for initial evaluations, for follow-up care, for setting, and really just what you've been seeing or hearing or watching for in terms of how it's going to be and in what ways it's going to be allowed.
Yeah, I my crystal ball tells me, based on what I'm seeing over and over again, is the establishment of a patient relationship. If states were already conservative and concerned about some of the large companies coming in and doing services in their state, then they are requiring an in-person visit to establish a patient relationship. But we have seen some loosening of that in individual states. So you do have to look up your individual state for that, although my slide deck does point to that. I'm not sure which state you are part of, but there are some specific requirements for audio only and synchronous video and asynchronous services as well, which I couldn't cover in 15 minutes, but there are some asynchronous as well. And I think we have another one in the chat, Amanda. And John, if I didn't catch all of your points, please feel free to email me. I'll be happy to give you some additional information and even some resources if you need it. Or my friend Carol's in here as well. She may end up answering things.
Johnson, thank you. I am not seeing another question, Michelle, so I think we are okay.
Okay, perfect. Well, the point of these lightning webinars is we get this little bit of snippet of information quickly, and you're able to go back to your jobs and enjoy the rest of your day. Enjoy this spring day. Thank you for being here.